What's up out there, world? It's your boy Tommy on the spot for Watchalong Wrestling, and man, it feels so great to be right back with all of you right here on the Watchalong Wrestling YouTube channel. If you've stumbled across this, make sure you smash that like button and hit subscribe so that all of these updates continue to come into your inbox, and I promise you, we got some big things in the works. This is not going to be a one-off. I'm back. I'm excited to be back. You look fantastic. Seriously, you just look like $1,000,000. Come on in, sit down, and let's chat The Mortician, the story of Paul Bearer. This debuted over the weekend. It's a part of the 30 Days of Undertaker celebration on the WWE Network, celebrating 30 years of The Undertaker. That's all leading up to his final farewell at the Survivor Series. Whether or not it actually ends up being his final farewell, I hope not. I like The Undertaker. I'm a fan of the guy. I hope that that's not the end of The Undertaker. Hopefully, you know, we get the lights out, we get the dong, we get all that for many years to come, even if it's not in a match capacity. But this is being heralded as his final farewell, and WWE Network doing a really good job, as they have done in the past with Undertaker. They did this for the 25 phenomenal years leading into the 2015 Survivor Series, and this year being no exception. 30 days to the day, November the 22nd, 2020, of his debut back at Survivor Series 1990 on November 22nd, 1990. So this special last night, and I do plan on going through all of the specials that were on the Undertaker kind of the 30 Days of Undertaker, but I wanted to hit on this one because I watched it last night and I thought it was just so great. If you have not seen this, put this on pause, go ahead, save this into your little bookmarks, put it to the side, go watch the documentary, then come back, watch along with me, and we'll chat about it, because I thought last night's or I guess I'm recording this here on Monday, so yeah, I think it was yesterday, it debuted on the WWE Network, and I thought it was so good. Such a great special, such a great tribute to the man that was Paul Bearer. And first and foremost, and I'm not going to go through the entire documentary. I don't want to give you every little bit and piece and break down each piece. That's not what we do here. I'm just going to hit you with my favorite parts of this, why I liked it so much, and at the end, I'll circle back to my meeting with Paul Bearer over WrestleMania 27 weekend at WWE Access, and what a sweetheart he was. So stay tuned for that at the end, but I thought this piece, first thing that jumped out at me, first and foremost, and one of the things that I just absolutely adored, was that there was a huge interview with Paul Bearer. Like, I expected you were going to get maybe some stock footage, some bits and pieces here and there, but for the most part, this was going to be some of his peers kind of reminiscing and waxing poetic about what Paul Bearer meant to the industry of pro wrestling, but not at all. Like, yes, you had all of that, but there was a interview with Paul Bearer that was filmed in 2011. And at first I looked at this and I was like, this must have been made for maybe the manager's DVD or something to that extent. But no, because that DVD came out in 2006. So this is a completely separate interview. I don't know what it was necessarily done for, but it really added so much to this piece, because you had so much Paul Bearer just sitting there talking about his career, never before seen, at least to my vantage point, footage of every single piece of his career, going back to, you know, how he got his start with Michael Hayes, something I never knew about. And I'm like a huge WWE fan. I don't know how much wrestling history I know, though. So for me, this was great, because it went through all of Paul Bearer's time in the territories, coming up with Michael Hayes. Him and Michael Hayes were friends growing up, so they both got into the business together. And then they talk about how, you know, Paul Bearer started out wrestling, and they basically said, hey, this guy looks like a great manager, which Paul Bearer kind of took a little offense to, like, how bad am I in the ring if they're thinking I'm a great manager? But they really show how he was, you know, kind of buddy-buddy with, you know, kind of paired up with the likes of Ric Flair. Lex Luger, who they show a footage of Lex Luger, where, like, Lex Luger was super green in this clip. This was, like, very early into Lex Luger's run. The aforementioned Rick Rude, some of the other folks, Mick Foley, before he even became, obviously, even Cactus Jack, they showed him in the territories working with Paul Bearer back when he was Percy Pringle. And then probably one of the real early highlights from this territory run was his relationship with The Undertaker. And they talked about how during one of Undertaker's very first matches as Texas Red, a masked man who was just getting his start in the business, Percy Pringle was his manager. So Paul Bearer and Undertaker's paths had crossed way back then, and they joked that really Percy Pringle's entire reason for being there with Texas Red was kind of to direct him back to the locker room after one of his very early matches with Bruiser Brody, because they showed Brody just absolutely just manhandling The Undertaker, which was really a sight to be seen because you just don't expect The Undertaker, of all people, to be manhandled. But he had to pay his dues just like anyone else, and definitely did that at the receipt of some stiff shots from Bruiser Brody. But interesting to see The Undertaker and Bruiser Brody kind of going at it while Undertaker was Texas Red. You got to see some highlights from that, and it was interesting to kind of see how Percy Pringle, Paul Bearer, had gotten his start with Undertaker. I loved it. I thought that was really cool. And at the same time, this kind of goes through some stuff about Paul Bearer's regular life. He talks, outside of wrestling. He talks about how the assassination of JFK really meant a lot to him. And they showed some footage of actual JFK, his speech, kind of what the assassination meant to the world. They showed some footage of John F. Kennedy kind of going down that famous road in Texas, and talked about how much this meant to Paul Bearer. And so at that moment, Paul Bearer decided he really wanted to become a funeral director. And so he had two loves, funerals and wrestling. And it mentioned how during his time growing up, if anyone had died, if the turtle died in the middle of the road, they'd scoop up the turtle, they'd bring him back, and he'd do a little funeral for the turtle itself. So I thought that was really nice. I got to know a little bit about Paul Bearer, the man himself, and a lot of his old artifacts which were there, his calendar books, which were like circled the first time Vince McMahon called them. That was just incredible. Like the fact that somebody is storing this stuff and was able to donate these or to lend this stuff to WWE for this piece, I think just really added to it. They talked about a little bit of his life with his wife Diane, who he just absolutely adored and who meant the world to him. And they talked about, when Diane and he had kids, he kind of maybe tried to go away from the territories a bit and realized, hey, maybe he just needs to settle on a real job and leave the pro wrestling business. And it was actually Rick Rude who reached out to Paul Bearer and said, hey, wait a second, calm down, hold on. You're not going anywhere. Take this number, call this number. And he's the one who connected Paul Bearer with WWE back, in 1990. And they talked about how when Paul Bearer, maybe it was even in 1989, but at around that time, they talked about how just when Paul Bearer came over, I guess it was 1990, Undertaker had been starting off, and he had been with Brother Love. Something I never knew at the time was it was kind of cool because I always wondered. I was like, why did Undertaker debut with Brother Love and then immediately go over to Paul Bearer? Well, they got into this. They talked about how, with obviously all the backstage duties that Brother Love, Bruce Pritchard, had, he couldn't really devote all the time to being the manager of The Undertaker, so they were already looking for a replacement. Here comes Paul Bearer, and at the time, it was actually Road Warrior Hawk who they credited with coming up with the name for Paul Bearer based on the idea that he's going to be Paul Bearer based off of being a pallbearer. So I thought that was really interesting, and obviously once they found out that, hey, this guy's a mortician in real life, he's a funeral director in real life, it just made so much sense to have him kind of come over and cross back over and just kind of slide right in there with The Undertaker. So he immediately takes over as Undertaker, and they just show how, like, at that minute, like, their relationship was like this, and they're off to the races. They talk about the first time going to MSG. They show all this really interesting footage of old school Undertaker and Paul Bearer traveling together. Stuff that, like, I just love to see. They showed some of these old vignettes with Taker and with Paul Bearer together. They showed their first WrestleMania together, WrestleMania 7. They showed SummerSlam 1992, and this was really cool. They showed how these guys are going into this building, and Paul Bearer was, like, really big on taking all of this stuff in, which I always thought with, like, these WWE wrestlers are just flying from town to town to town. Do they have a minute to be like, look how cool this is to be at the place where we're currently at? Like, do they have a minute to see some of the sights and sounds? And Undertaker credits Paul Bearer with always living in the moment and really kind of being that guy to sort of make sure to take everything in, to let everything sit there, and really make Undertaker then in turn appreciate that. So they have this great piece of this great picture of Paul Bearer, Undertaker, and I think it was the Godfather, who I guess at the time was Papa Shango, standing in the middle of Wembley Stadium with the SummerSlam background behind them, and they show that great footage of Paul Bearer coming out, the hearse behind him, and just really, really good stuff. At some point, they talk about the evolution. Paul Bearer mentions how, like, Undertaker was pretty much running roughshod over WWE for 6 years, and he just kind of grabbed on Undertaker's coattails and went along for the ride. And you think about that. These guys got together at the end of 1990, and they show all that footage of, Paul Bearer on the Brother Love show coming on, taking over Undertaker, and then really they stay together until SummerSlam 1996, and they got into some of that, and they talked about how, at the time, they loved the relationship they had together, but WWE wanted Undertaker to kind of, I guess, mold and to become a little bit bigger of a presence. And so in doing so, he had to kind of improve and talk more. So he couldn't have Paul Bearer there to do all the talking for him, because then the character of The Undertaker was almost, I guess, one-dimensional in a way. So they ended up splitting the two separately at SummerSlam 1996. Paul Bearer turns on Undertaker, Boiler Room Brawl, goes with Mankind. And Undertaker then, not too long after this, wins the title at WrestleMania 13. But then they talk about how now Paul Bearer, even though the thought was, hey, maybe Paul Bearer is holding back the star of The Undertaker, but he's a star of his own right at this point. So they talk about how Paul Bearer was then able to work with Mick Foley, was able to work with Goldust, was able to work with the Executioner, Terry Gordy even, before eventually getting into his relationship then with Kane. And they tell some really funny stories about his relationship with Kane, and they talk about how they would travel the road together. That famous story about how when Paul Bearer asked Kane if he didn't mind driving, and Kane's got the ski mask on, and Paul Bearer's yelling out the window to all of the fans who are watching saying, "Kane can drive! It's a miracle!" And so I thought that was really funny. And they also talked about, they actually showed footage of Kane and Paul Bearer getting off the tour bus, and Kane's got the little black towel over his head, which, like, I always thought growing up, like, you'd wait outside for some of the stars to leave, like, it would have been crazy to see, like, unmasked Kane, like, even though everyone kind of knew who he was. And he actually got into this in the documentary. Kane talks about, when the character for Kane was first brought up, there were people who were really worried about whether or not Glenn Jacobs would be able to carry the presence of Kane, because of the fact that at the end of the day, Kane was really the third or fourth gimmick that Glenn Jacobs had in WWE. He was obviously Isaac Yankem, he was the fake Diesel, and so Kane even says, I had a couple gimmicks that didn't really work out, so now I'm being basically given the Undertaker's brother, a huge storyline that I'm being given here, and there were people that were a little nervous about whether or not he'd be able to handle that. So that was interesting. It was interesting to hear. I feel like Kane doesn't usually talk about these older gimmicks, so I kind of liked hearing him talk about that stuff. I thought it was a lot of fun, and they actually did a really nice job, I thought, to that perspective. And then they talk about how Undertaker and Paul Bearer got back together, showed some great rib stories, including this one where Austin's being embalmed, I think it was, and Paul Bearer's like, rip off his shirt, and Undertaker rips off the shirt, and then Paul Bearer's like, and away with his pants, and kind of pretends to pull his pants off, and then Austin totally breaks character and laughs, and they show him joking around with Earl Hebner, pretending to make out with Earl Hebner, pretending he didn't notice the cameras were there, getting up and playing around with the fact that a chair was stuck to his rear end. Really funny stuff. Like, this guy just came across as a guy who loved pro wrestling, was such a fan, was so infectious, and you could tell just a guy who you wanted around in the locker room. So I thought that stuff was really fun. They eventually show how Undertaker obviously continued to evolve during the Attitude Era. He now becomes American Badass, and there really wasn't a role for Paul Bearer, so he kind of helped out in the back. Undertaker said it was kind of like they found something for him to do as a thank you for all that Paul Bearer did for the WWE for the number of years that he did. This leads to, unfortunately, Paul Bearer's wife getting cancer. William Moody's wife, I guess, getting cancer, and him needing to take some years off. So he disappears for a few years until Undertaker's coming back for WrestleMania 20. And they talk about his returning the dead man, WrestleMania 20. They wanted to do something big. They wanted to bring Paul Bearer back, which was interesting because Undertaker actually came out and said that he didn't necessarily want Paul Bearer back. He thought, hey, you're bringing my character way too far back. Like, this is supposed to be an evolution of the dead man, and you're kind of bringing it all the way back, bringing back Paul Bearer. So he was a little bit against it, but eventually came around to the idea. And they talk about how a lot of people were reaching out to Paul Bearer. Jim Ross, they even showed Jim Ross's letters that he wrote to Paul Bearer and emails he wrote to Paul Bearer, kind of begging him and pleading with him, like, hey, where are you at? Like, why aren't you returning our calls? Come back to WWE. We want you for this big storyline at WrestleMania 20, Madison Square Garden, your dream building. And Paul Bearer actually wrote and said, I'm sorry, but right now I'm just in no shape to be able to do it. His wife had cancer. He had kind of gone through a bit of a bout with depression there, ballooned to over 500 pounds. So that part was really sad, and it was sad to see him kind of at that stage in his life. They eventually talk about how when, at that point, WWE was like, all right, well, if we're going to have him come back, we need him to be in a healthy state. Let's care about the person more than just the wrestler, or the personality, rather. So they paid for, they signed him back up. He signed a contract, and as his sign-on bonus, it was enough money to cover his gastric bypass surgery. But even so, unfortunately, they get into when he does come back with The Undertaker for WrestleMania 20. He's just in no shape to be able to do it. They even talk about at the end of the match at WrestleMania 20, something I didn't even pick up on until kind of rewatching this. Undertaker gets down and he's, doing the whole hand deal, looking up for the casket, and Paul Bear's holding the urn, and Paul Bear's holding the urn outside of the ring because he couldn't even get into the ring because he couldn't climb up the stairs. So it was really, really sad to see that, and it kind of, at the time I thought like, wow, Paul Bear was only here for a couple months and then was just gone, and sad to find out that the reason for that was just because he was in such bad shape, health-wise, and had put on so much weight that he was just in no condition to really be a major part of the storyline with The Undertaker. So they talk about how, unfortunately, that run didn't work out. Paul Bear's wife, unfortunately, passes away in 2009, which is terrible, and breast cancer is just the absolute worst. But they also mention his run back in 2010 and how he eventually comes back to the family, and he's a part of that big Undertaker-Kane trilogy at the end of 2010 that, I'll be completely honest, I completely forgot about. And if it wasn't for my friends over at Talking Taker, who, great podcast, they talk about every single match, The Undertaker's entire career on pay-per-view. If it wasn't for them, I had completely blacked out about this Kane-Undertaker feud at the end of 2010. Completely forgot about it. But they talk about Paul Bear's involvement in it, how he shows up in the casket, he sits up, everyone goes nuts. And that was really his last involvement, unfortunately, until his passing in 2013. But they talk about him going into the Hall of Fame, and they even mention how when he went into the Hall of Fame, part of WrestleMania 30 weekend, Undertaker, this is the first time he had been at the Hall of Fame, he shows up and kind of pays homage to him. And they also do touch on the fact that Paul Bear, the year prior, was a part of the Undertaker CM Punk storyline right after his death. And they really kind of left it up to Undertaker whether or not they wanted to include Paul Bear. And at first, obviously, he was trepidatious. You're including a man who legitimately died and playing off that weeks later for a WrestleMania build. But he said if anybody would have wanted to be a part of a storyline, it would have been Paul Bear. And the idea that this guy's death ended up being a focal point of a big major match at WrestleMania, he just absolutely would have been tickled to death with it and would have been totally down. And by all intents and purposes, everything you see here, this guy was a total wrestling fan. Everyone loved him. And it definitely shed some light for me on that storyline, because I thought it was a little tasteless at the time. Love CM Punk, love The Undertaker, but I just didn't think it even needed to have the Paul Bear stuff in there. So it was good to know that, and that almost made me think, okay, you know what? Hey, maybe he really would have been that guy. From watching this piece, he would have been that guy who would have liked to have his death, I guess, used for such a storyline and almost a bit of a tribute. So a really great piece, though. 55 minutes. Go out of your way to see it. Never long enough. These pieces are so great. These documentaries, they're never long enough. But what they do, and it's interesting because they don't do DVDs anymore, right? And I hate it. I wish they still did the DVD pieces, the Blu-rays with the documentary and the little extras and the little side pieces. But if you go ahead and you do your research, you look on YouTube, you'll see a couple of little extra pieces, little interviews, little bonus features, so to speak. Those are all on YouTube. And then they have a little playlist full of matches that, if they created a Blu-ray, you would have had this documentary, you would have had the extra interviews and pieces and whatever on the YouTube, and then you would have had that collection of matches as your discs 2s and 3s. So they have all that, a lot of great moments that they did. But check this piece out. I can't recommend it enough. It was awesome, so much fun. And it did remind me back to 2011, WrestleMania 27, my first WrestleMania, WrestleMania Access. And who did I get to meet but Paul Bear himself? He was sitting there and was able to go over, say hello. He was awesome. And it's weird because you expect at Access, you're going to go, well, great to meet you, great, quick photo. Can we do a quick picture? Maybe not, and you kind of go on your own way. But they had really, he really got to ask me what my name was. Ask me, hey, this is your first WrestleMania, make sure you enjoy it. Take in every moment. I told him I just listened to an interview with him on the way over, and he said, oh, with who? And I got to tell him about that, and I think it was with PW Insider or something silly like that, and he remembered the interview, remembered what he talked about in that interview, put over Mike Johnson of PW Insider being a good dude, and saying how important it was to support those wrestling journalists, and I thought that was really interesting, and because you hear so many things from people in the business that they hate the quote-unquote dirt sheets, which I hate using that word because I'm a huge fan of a lot of those guys. And at the end of the day, I thought it was awesome to hear him putting over the wrestling journalists like Mike Johnson, the folks at PW Insider. I thought that was just really a lot of fun, and it was great to see. And I have a great photo of me looking at Paul Bear, and I'm dressed completely silly in an Affliction hoodie with a beanie on, just thinking I'm the coolest guy around. But I'm just smiling from ear to ear because of how cool Paul Bear was, and he was joking around with me, and I'm glad I got to meet him, man. Rest in peace to Paul Bear, but this is a great tribute. Go out of your way, watch this piece, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed my little review here, let me know in the comment section below. I plan on doing a lot more of these types of pieces on this minutia stuff that WWE does, these documentaries. I love this stuff. I may not watch every single episode of Raw or SmackDown right now, as I just had a kid and we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's no fans and it might not be as entertaining, but WWE documentaries, I make sure I catch all of them, and I love them, and they bring me back to the days of collecting DVDs, and yeah, just so much fun. So the Mortician, the real story of Paul Bear, go out of your way, check it out. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time in the next video.